we are now going to look at some production costs. And to do that, we're going to review one of the production cost exercise that you guys have worked through probably already. So let's first go back and think through all of our costs that we know. We know the costs are made up of both fixed costs and variable costs. Previously, when you guys were looking at production information, you were considering how does the input impact the output. So we looked at perhaps how fertilizer impacts the yield of corn, or maybe how feed impacts the production of hundredweight of beef. So we take an input, something that we use to produce with, and we see how does that cause the output to go up. And at some point we knew that through the law of diminishing marginal returns, if we put on too much input, we're going to eventually have that output reach a maximum, and then it's going to decline because we've used too much. We've over-fertilized, we've over-watered, we've overfed, we've done something that has caused the output to reduce in total output produced. From here now, what we're looking at is we're taking our output we have produced, and we want to know what it costs us, and then also how much money it makes us. So this new batch of information that you've been studying is all about costs and revenue. So we're now more on what we consider the output side of production costs. And as we did that, we had two different types of costs. We had fixed costs and variable costs. Fixed costs are those costs that even if you didn't produce anything this year, they wouldn't change. So in other words, if I have a field and I choose not to grow anything on it this year, there's some things I'm still going to pay for. My machinery is still going to sit in my yard and it's still going to depreciate even if I don't run it on the field this year. I'm still going to have some property taxes. I might have rent instead of property taxes. Maybe I'm renting it from somebody and maybe I'm still paying them rent even though I didn't grow anything on it. I gave you a list of what we call the dirty 5 for fixed costs. Depreciation, interest, rent, taxes, and insurance. Those are costs that basically stay the same even if there's no output changes. But most of our costs that we consider are more variable types of costs. They do change with the level of output. So for instance, as you put on more fertilizer, you produce more output and you have more of that cost. So that's a variable types of cost. Fertilizer, feed, veterinary expenses, seed, chemicals, all of those types of things are all going to be more variable related costs. Well, in what we do in economics, we like to take just one item and change it at a time, and we call it the variable input, and we let everything else kind of stay the same. We have those things that are completely fixed, our fixed costs, and we also have our other variable costs we're going to kind of hold constant for a while just because we don't want to change them all at once. So we typically will consider one thing changing. So in other words, we're probably just going to let X change, okay? We call that our input. Remember the letter X denoted the input, and that's going to give us an idea of what our costs are going to be as we adjust that. So our total fixed costs are something that's going to be the same all the time. Our total variable costs are going to change according to how much of that one input that we're changing, how much it has changed, times the price that it cost us to purchase that input. So then easily we know that our total costs are simply all of our fixed costs and all of our variable costs added together. So total costs are simply everything it costs us to produce that one particular output. If I'm producing corn, then it's all of my costs to produce corn. A lot of times you'll hear that called the cost of production, and so that's basically what we're talking about now. But the other thing is sometimes we want to know how much it costs us per unit. So we look at some of our costs on what we call average. So we call them an average cost. And we do that for all of our types of costs. We do it for fixed costs, we do it for variable costs, and we do it for our total costs. So our average fixed costs are simply the amount that we spend on the fixed costs per unit of output. So in other words, if it costs us, let's say we have an acre of corn that we're growing, and it costs us $200 in fixed costs in order to be able to produce that corn, and maybe I'm able to yield 200 bushels on that 1 acre. Well, if I take the total fixed costs and divide by how much I'm yielding, which is my output, $200 divided by 200 bushels of corn means that it costs me $1 per bushel in fixed cost to raise that corn. So all it is a cost per unit for our fixed costs. We do the exact same thing for variable costs. We want to know how much our variable costs are per unit. So perhaps for that same acre of corn, it costs you $400 in variable costs to grow your corn. If you're still producing those 200 bushels, then average variable cost is simply how much it's costing you per unit you're growing. So we're going to take our total variable costs of $400 divided by our output of 200 bushels of corn, and we then find that our average variable cost is $2 per bushel to grow the corn. So I've got $1 per bushel in fixed costs. I've got $2 per bushel in variable costs. So my average total costs are simply the amount of total costs per unit of output. So now we're taking our total costs and putting them on an average. So we're going to take our total cost, which was $200 in fixed costs and $400 in variable costs. We have $600 in total costs, and we're going to divide by how much output we're producing, which is the 200 bushels. So $600 in total cost divided by 200 bushels is $3 per bushel in total costs. Now, we could do that another way too. We already said that there was $1 per bushel in fixed costs, and there was $2 per bushel in variable costs. So if we add those two together, we know that there's $3 per bushel in total costs. So those are simply our averages, those ones that we want to know how much it is per unit of output.